Okay, could you please start making your way back? Let's make our way back. Good to see you this morning. I apologise for how cold it is in here. We've got one of these really U-Butte special air conditioners that only pumps cold air in winter and hot air in summer. So I'm not sure if that was a design flaw or something, but we have spent so much money trying to get this fixed that I think we've just probably given up and are looking towards replacing the whole system. So you can be praying about that for us, because I think it's going to cost us around $65,000 to do that. Yeah, like at least a week's worth of wages for me. So, it's going to be tough. All right, if you have your Bibles there, could you open them up to Matthew chapter 11, verses 1 to 6. Matthew chapter 11, verses 1 to 6. If you don't have them, you can read them on the screen here, hopefully. I'm going to read it this morning. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." One of the things I heard a lot going through COVID, and one of the things I thought to myself, especially during those early stages, was I just can't wait till things get back to normal. Anyone? Can we put the title slide up, please, Sarah? Thanks. I just can't wait until things get back to normal. Our lives were all chugging along quite nicely. Oh, we had our normal blips and pitfalls and bumps, all of that. But fundamentally, life was going along as we expected it to, and then bang. And we all wanted it to be over as quickly as we could so we could get back to the way things were. But what if things are never going to go back to the way things were? What if there's no going back to that place? Not completely anyway. And what if that's not a bad thing either? It's not always easy for us to comprehend that things have changed. It's not always easy for us to discern the things that have changed either, because there's often a lot of familiarity and continuity with the things that were in our past. We're still fundamentally us. We may still be married to the same people, have the same family, have the same friends, go to the same job, live in the same house. So there's this fair bit of continuity. So in some ways it's very difficult for us sometimes to put our finger on what it is that has actually changed. So maybe not as a whole lot has actually changed around us, but maybe something has changed in us. Maybe we're the ones that have changed and not our external circumstances. We're not the same anymore. And when things happen in life, we get changed. It's just what happens, especially big things. We are here one day, as I say, going along with our life, doing all the things we do, normal expectations and assumptions about how things work. We see the world in a particular way, we understand things in a particular way, we believe certain things, and we're just chugging along. And then something happens. And we find ourselves in this other spot where things are not so clear anymore. There's a bit of a malaise, there's a bit of a whirlwind in our mind, we're not sure what's happening, whatever. And then later on, we find ourselves over here in another place altogether where things have started to sort of coalesce a little bit. We may not be entirely sure exactly what that is, but the one thing we do know is we're not over here anymore. Richard Rohr, the Franciscan priest, has a way of describing this. He calls it order, disorder, reorder. And he talks about it in terms of how we actually process our own faith and belief and the evolution that goes on there. Sorry, I said the evolution word in church. Evolution, right? And so we start off in a place of order. We have things all lined up, all our ducks in a row. This is how the world works. This is who God is. This is my theology and my beliefs, all of this. Something happens to us and we come to this place of disorder where everything is in disarray and we're not sure which way is up or what we really believe about anything necessarily. And then we eventually get to a place, because we have to go through this disorder, we get to this place of reorder where we again start to assemble a working kind of framework, worldview again. We start to understand, I believe this now rather than that, and I understand this rather than that, and I value this rather than that. Not long ago, after making my way back here to this church, Rick, who was the senior pastor here at the time, asked me to come and preach in their January service. And I reluctantly said yes because I had been out of ministry and out of practice. So I wasn't really, to be honest, I was enjoying not preaching, just coming along like you guys and sitting there and just listening to other people do all the work, right? And so I was really out of practice. I wasn't looking forward to it. But he said, I want you to do it. I said, okay. Anyway, the theme was, because it was January, the theme was, this year I must remember to. And then there was an option to preach on something. But the stipulation was it had to begin with an E. I can't remember the reasoning behind that, but it had to begin with an E, right? There was probably a good reason, and I think it was like, I must remember to exercise my spiritual muscles and stuff like that, like about prayer and Bible reading and all this sort of stuff. But I was given a free kick. You can do it as long as it starts with an E. And I was like, okay. I thought, you know what? I'll talk about something really personal. I said, this year I must remember to embrace the journey, right? Because this was kind of a very personal thing, almost autobiographical thing that I was going to be able to share about the idea that when we begin years, we begin with this kind of fresh blank slate, right? Even if you physically buy a calendar, it's just, and a diary, it's like it's empty, and it's full of possibilities, and we put our plans in there and we imagine how the year is going to be, and then reality happens, right? And that year that we thought we were going to have, it works out sometimes, but a lot of times it doesn't work out, right? Sometimes it turns to custard. Because life throws a whole bunch of stuff that we weren't expecting. God gets involved and takes us on little detours that we weren't expecting, okay? And my point was this, if we don't embrace that up front, we're going to find ourselves constantly frustrated by all these things that we see as inconveniences and hindrances and barriers to what we wanted to do, right? But the Bible says the plans of man, are in the heart, but what? God determines your steps, right? So we make our plans, but God determines our steps. There are things that we can make our plans. God says, fine, make your plans. But don't be surprised if I take you on a few detours. And if we don't accept that up front, we'll just be constantly frustrated. Why isn't this working? And constantly trying to get back on track rather than realise that perhaps these things are not detours, they're actually new directions that we need to be taking. That God is actually taking us into other places that we would not necessarily voluntarily go ourselves because we don't know that we need to go there. And so God, through a variety of circumstances and sometimes direct intervention, if we're really thick like me, he manages to get us going. And I say this was autobiographical for me because we were at this church in 1990, 1991 and 1992 as students when we ran the youth ministry. I know, right? I look like a youth pastor, don't I? But back then I was much younger and cool and all of those things. And so we ran the youth ministry back then. And then we went and planted a church. From this church, we led that for 15 years. And at the end of that 15 years, we were both completely burnt out, completely wiped out. And to be honest, I'd lost my faith. I walked away. I didn't want anything to do with God anymore. That's how bad it was for me personally. And then Heather kind of made her way back to church and eventually sort of corralled me into sort of coming along with her. And here I stood in 2008, all these years later, in the same place that I had preached before with one significant difference. I was not the same person that I was when I'd stood here all those years before. I had been profoundly changed by everything that I had been through in those intervening years, the good, the bad, and the indifferent. You with me? I had changed. There is this saying, the person who falls off a horse is not the same person who gets back on it. We're hopefully a lot wiser. We're hopefully a lot more respectful about the damage a horse can do to you if you don't ride one properly. But the person who falls off a horse is not the person who gets back on. We are all changed in so many ways, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, by the things that we experience and that we go through. And here's the thing. How many of us actually take the time to try and identify what that is that has changed in us and why it has changed? How many of us take the time to examine ourselves and to think that through and go, what is it that has actually shifted for me? We intuitively know something has shifted, but we're often not sure what or why. And both of those things matter. And the reason they matter is this. Because if we don't identify what that is, and the new position where we are now as opposed to where we were, then we will go through life with this kind of low-grade feeling of being out of sync with the world around us all the time, even our own inner world. Something will seem not quite right. Something will seem a little bit clunky. We'll be a little bit irritated. We'll be a little bit unsure about a whole sorts of things. There'll be something that's just not quite right if we don't take time to go, what is it that has shifted for me and why is it that it has shifted? So over the next 2 weeks, starting today, we're going to be looking at this topic of something happened and see that, one, it is normal, very, very normal to go through this type of thing in life and to experience these changes. In fact, if you're not going through this stuff, then something's awry. But it is completely normal. Secondly, it is very necessary to process that and work it through. And this week I'm starting with that something about how it affects our faith and our belief. And next week I've got a very special guest coming that I'm going to be interviewing on how COVID has impacted us psychologically and socially in ways that most of us haven't even recognised at the moment. So the woman I've got coming along next week is a woman called Helen Van Wyk. She's a very highly regarded Christian counsellor who's been dealing with, counselling for a long time, but dealing with a lot of the impact of COVID over these last couple of years. And she's got some amazing stuff to share. So don't miss that, right? Don't think, I don't need that, it's not applicable to me. It is applicable to you. Don't think, oh, I'm good. Look, I'm the most self-aware person in the world. And even I missed out on some stuff, right? As I was sitting there on the phone talking to her, she was telling me all this stuff and I'm going, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Oh, now you mention it. Yes. So come along because it's going to be absolutely eye-opening for you. But back today. Something happens and something changes for us. Now, even the people in the Bible experience this. If you want to look at their stories closely, the people in the Bible experience this. Time and again, they went through something, either personally or collectively, and then emerged out the other side of that with a different understanding of themselves and God and their place in the world. The Old Testament is absolutely full of this type of stuff. In fact, it was one of the ways God revealed his nature and his character to people was through their experiences. They would find themselves in need of something, God would turn up, do something for them, and they would go, oh, he's Jehovah Jireh, he's our provider. They would go into battle, they would prevail in battle, and they would go, oh, Jehovah Nissi, he is our banner, right? So they were finding out these things about God through the experiences. And in the New Testament, we get the same thing. We get Paul on his Damascus road. Now, Paul is Saul at the time. He's actually en route to persecuting the church, to arresting Christians, having them thrown in jail, tortured, and potentially even killed. He encounters the risen Jesus. He begins to see everything in a completely new light. That's an understatement, right? And becomes the apostle of grace to the Gentiles from a Pharisee. What an amazing shift. Peter, again, good Jewish boy, goes up on the roof, has a bit of a vision on the roof like we all do sometimes, ends up God saying, I want you to go to this place in Joppa and then I want you to go and see this Roman centurion, the enemy, this Gentile, Cornelius, and I want you to tell him the gospel. And he does, and the whole way is opened up to the Gentiles. Now, I realise that our experiences are not as dramatic or supernatural as that. But please, correct me if I'm wrong. If you've encountered the risen Christ on your drive to work one day, congratulations. But, for most of us, we don't have those great, massive, experiences. But it doesn't mean that the experiences that we have are any less transformative or affecting, okay? So I don't want us to minimise our stuff and go, oh, that was just this and that was just that. No, something's going on in that, and it could be that God is trying to move the needle a little bit, right? So don't dismiss them. They're not as dramatic, but they're just as transformative. So there's this episode in Matthew 11. This is what I'm going to look at. This is more at our level, garden variety stuff, right? Where even John the Baptist is confronted with one of those moments. Now, unfortunately, we don't know where this event actually takes John in the end, because John, we know, is actually executed. He's beheaded through no fault of his own. He's beheaded. So we don't know where it lands. But it gives us a really good sneak peek into the dynamics of this type of thing that I'm talking about. This something that happens and the changes and the questioning that occurs in someone. So let's just set the stage, right? John is the cousin of Jesus. You understand that, right? And he has been anointed as the forerunner. He's the one who comes to prepare the way for Jesus, to prepare the way for the Messiah. And this was so powerfully in John that it says even in the womb, when he was about 6 months old, when Mary came to visit her cousin Elizabeth to say, I'm pregnant with the Messiah, it said the baby inside Elizabeth's womb leapt, which was John, leapt for joy, right? So there's this intuitive spiritual understanding of who's who. Later on, when John is baptizing in the Jordan, out in the wilderness and in the Jordan River, he's saying to people, don't get me confused with the Messiah. I'm not the Messiah. There is one who is coming after me. I'm just here to prepare the way, whose sandals I am unfit to untie. And then as he's baptizing people, he stops one day and he points at Jesus and he says, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And then he baptizes Jesus. Jesus comes to him and says, you need to baptize me. And John, knowing who Jesus is, says, that doesn't sound right. Okay, you should be baptizing me. And Jesus said, no, this is the way it's got to be. So John baptizes him. And when Jesus comes out of the water, and this was the same, this happened for me at my baptism, right? The heavens opened, right? And the Spirit descended like a dove on Jesus, right? This next bit didn't happen for me, but then a voice from heaven came and said, this is my Son with whom I am well pleased, right? Now, let me ask you a question. Is there any confusion in John's mind as to who Jesus is? Right? There's no ambiguity, is there? John knows who Jesus is, and yet John sends his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the one we're expecting, or should we be expecting somebody else? Why does he say that? Well, the answer is in verse 2. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? John was going through a very disruptive thing that was manifesting itself in two ways. It was having a go at two things in John's life. One had to do with where he was. His personal circumstances didn't gel with his expectations of his life in ministry. So his expectations were under assault. Secondly, the other had to do with what he believed, about what he was hearing about what Jesus the Messiah was now doing, and how that didn't gel with his assumptions about how the Messiah should operate. So that was under attack as well. So where was John when he asked those questions? He was in prison. Right? He's very clear-eyed about who Jesus is while he's out in the countryside, while he's out doing his thing, preaching, preparing the way, baptizing everyone, calling them to repentance in preparation for Jesus. He's confident why the world is working the way he expects it to work, the way he anticipates that it should work. And isn't that true? Aren't we all like that? Don't we all do that? When the planets are aligned, when the world is as it should be, when everything is in its place and it's all ticking along as we had planned and as we wanted, of course we feel good and we feel confident. It's great. And there's a kind of affirmation and a validation in that for us, that our choices are the right choices. We're making good decisions. We've picked the right plan. We've got the right values and our efforts are all paying off. Life is good. And we are on the right track. But then, through no fault of your own, all of this comes to an abrupt end, and you find yourself, metaphorically, in prison, wondering what on earth has just happened. That's going to make you question stuff, right? That's going to make you second guess yourself. That's going to challenge the way that you see things. And so John is thrown. I'm doing what I was told to do. I'm doing what I was anointed to do. And it was all working out. And then 1 minute, because some dude wants to get it on with that girl and she's going to do a funky dance, and in order for her to do the funky dance, she wants my head on a platter. Like, that ain't fair. Like, how did we get into this place? So go and ask Jesus if he is actually the Messiah. Because my life's just taken a pretty significant turn for the worse. And what's the implicit reasoning going on here? I'm not sure anymore, because if you were the one and I was doing what I was supposed to do, then I shouldn't be here. You know, it's funny. We know from a cursory reading of the Bible that that's not how it works, right? All the people in the Bible, from the beginning right through to the end, yeah, they make their mistakes and whatever, but largely we're talking about people who've, they've made the final cut. They've got into the book. They're in there because they're heroes of the faith. They're people that have, that are really serious about it. And yet their life never turns out exactly as you would expect for someone who is being completely faithful to God, right? There's always these ups and downs. Sometimes there's vindication in the end, sometimes there's not. But there's universally, there is never a time where they aren't going through something incredibly difficult. And they're all trying to do the right thing. So where do we get this idea that if we would just be faithful, and if we would just be obedient, and if we would just be passionate about God and be in the will of God, right, then our life, it's always going to be up and to the right. Right? Where do we get that idea? Well, we get it from churches. People talk about this stuff. They say it quite explicitly. I mean, you have to fish around in the Bible quite a bit and make verses and stories go places that they don't go, but that's what people do. So we haven't plucked it out of thin air, but it's not there. It's not there in the Bible. There is no promise that if we do all of those things, that if we're in the center of the will of God, everything's going to be okay. John is a case in point. John is smack dab in the middle of the will of God for his life, doing exactly what he has been told. And then because there's some other shenanigans going on here, he ends up losing his life. And I get it, right? For the most part, sometimes, we can go through life and it can kind of work for us to some extent. As I say, sometimes you actually see people up on stage and they basically, I'm living proof of this theory. Look at my life. I'm faithful to God and now I'm doing really well. And everyone's like, yeah, I want your life. Well, there's a lot more to it than that. But sometimes it can work for us until it doesn't. And then when it doesn't, what is it that we actually do with that? Maybe for some people, drastic change in their circumstance doesn't make them question anything. But for the rest of us humans, sometimes it makes us question everything, doesn't it? Depending what happens to us, sometimes things make us question everything. I was with my mentor a couple of weeks ago. I get mentored. Can you believe it? I thought I'd outgrown the need to grow, but there you go. And he said, one of the first questions he asked me, he looked me in the face and he said, Adrian, where is God in your life right now? And I'm really good at not answering questions, right? Because if you haven't worked it out, I could talk the leg off a stool, right? I just take people on a loop, and by the time I'm finished, they're so confused, they just want to get out of there, right? I thought, no, stuff it, I'm just going to be honest. And I said, okay, here's a perfect situation. Me and God, we're standing in the same room and we're staring at each other and it's a standoff. He said, what do you mean by that? And I said, God wants me to say, I trust you. And I'm saying, I've tried that and it hasn't worked. Right? I'm being completely honest with you here. I'm not saying it's going to go anyplace bad. I'm telling you what I'm wrestling with myself. Because you know my story. My life was going along swimmingly. No. But the stuff that's happened to me since COVID with the cancer and everything, that's really made me question a lot of things. And you know what the funny thing is? I would say to you explicitly, I do not believe that if you do what God wants, it provides some sort of immunity and protection from the bad things in life. But you know what? Implicitly, I have bought into that story. I have. Because one of my main arguments with God at the moment was, but we've always done what you wanted us to do. the implicit thing in there is, therefore, how come I've ended up here? And so we're having a chat about that one. Anyway, I was so honest, I think my mentor is getting counselling from what I'd said. I said, at the end of it, he just went, that was a lot. And I said, you asked. Anyway, he's a fantastic guy. I love him to death, and I'm so glad he's there to ask me those type of questions. Anyway, maybe some people don't question anything, but some of us, sometimes, we start to question everything, and that's not a bad thing, right? We've got to stop thinking about these moments when we get thrown for a wobble, where we start doubting things, where we reassess things, where we start to question everything. We've got to stop thinking of these times as losing our faith or backsliding, right? They're not. It is a perfectly normal growth phase we're going through. You don't grow without questioning. You don't grow without reassessing things. So we've got to stop feeling like when someone says, I don't know where God is at the moment, or me and God are having a standoff, or I'm not even thinking about God at the moment. We don't go, into a 3-alarm fire and go, oh no, they're losing their faith. No, they're just going through a thing. They're in that disorder phase right now where they're not sure where it's all going and what it all means. And it's okay. It is okay. You know what I love about this story? When John sent his disciples back to Jesus to say, are you the Messiah? Or should we just expect someone else? Jesus let him question and answered him. He didn't get all indignant and go, you've got to be joking. You've got to be joking. John doesn't get it? He's been bigging me up the whole time. And now he doesn't know who I am? John, what's happened to your faith, mate? No. He meets John where he is at in his questioning. He meets him. He doesn't berate him. He doesn't get down on him. He says, okay, go back and tell him this. And he goes back and he tells him this. Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Why does Jesus end with that? Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Why? Well, let's look. John is in prison, number one. He's thrown a bit because his expectations of how his life was going to work out have not been met. That could cause you to stumble, yes? That's a pretty big thing. But he was also thrown because he'd heard about what Jesus was doing, his Messiah was doing, and it wasn't quite connecting with his assumptions about what the Messiah was doing. Jesus responded with, go and tell John what you see and hear. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, dead are raised, good news is proclaimed to the poor. What is Jesus doing here? Jesus is referencing and quoting Isaiah 61. Isaiah 61, if you don't know, is the Messiah's position description, right? When they put out the job advert for Messiah, it was in the essential criteria, right? You need to be able to do all of this. You need to be able to heal the deaf, cleanse the leper, preach good news to the poor, all of this. This is what? This was the PD of the Messiah. Every switched-on Jewish person knew that, and every switched-on Jewish person was expecting the Messiah to turn up and to do all of these things. This is how we'll know if someone is the Messiah. They're doing all of that stuff, except when Jesus quotes and references Isaiah 61, he leaves out, and the same thing happens in the story in Luke 4, which I'll look at another day. You know the story where they go to throw Jesus off a cliff? All right, it's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, because when Jesus quotes Isaiah 61, he leaves off, in their opinion, the best and the juiciest piece, which is this: to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Okay, fine, but this is the bit. And the day of vengeance of our God, right? There was this expectation that not only would the Messiah come and do all this healing, he would overthrow Israel's enemies. And God's vengeance would be unleashed on everyone who had oppressed Israel. And they would be set free, and all the others would be punished in some way. So this expectation that the Messiah was going to come was quite militaristic. He was going to come and he was going to kick their butt. And so when John says, go back and ask, are you the one to come? Why is he asking that? Because I'm hearing about the dead being raised. I'm hearing about the deaf getting their hearing back. I'm hearing about cleansed lepers and blind people receiving their sight. I'm not hearing a lot of butt-kicking of Romans going on. Actually, Jesus, if I can be quite frank, you're being kind to them. You're healing their servants and you're engaging with them. What's going on there? This is why Jesus says, blessed is anyone who does not stumble, who does not fall away because of me. Because that's exactly what happens sometimes for people. God does not do as they expect. He does not act in line with their assumptions and their expectations, and so they give up on God because they think it's their only option when things work out that way. But here's your $3 coffee quote for the day, right? Here's your tweetable $3 coffee quote. You are less likely to stumble if you have permission to wrestle. Right? You are less likely to stumble if you have permission to wrestle. If you think that it's wrong to have your doubts and your questions and that if you do, that something bad has happened and you're losing your faith, more often than not, you think the only option is to walk away. And a lot of people do. A lot of people do. But if you're told what you're going through is entirely normal, it is a part of you growing and deepening as a human being and a person of faith, and you are going to come through this and have a greater understanding of God and yourself and the way things work than you ever imagined. This is how you get there. You don't learn this out of a book. You learn this through a life experience. This is what is going on for you. When you have permission to wrestle with that, it's a different story. I get it, right? It's tricky when God doesn't meet our expectations or line up with our beliefs about how He should work. It can be confusing, it can be destabilizing, it can be frustrating, it can even be devastating, but it is also an opportunity for us to allow God to help us confront our own thinking. What were the assumptions we were operating on? Were they in fact correct assumptions? Has God actually let us down? Has God dropped the ball? Or did I just have the wrong expectation of God all along? John's sitting in that prison going, I'm not hearing about the Romans getting what they're due. It wasn't Jesus that was misaligned, it was John. So it's an opportunity for us to go and question those things. When I started to go to God, it's not fair, we did what you wanted and now I've ended up here. It's not God that's misaligned. It has been my understanding and expectation of God in that space. And I have to work that through. And that's what was going on for John. Jesus was the Messiah he'd been waiting for. He'd been right about 99% of it. But he just was not the type of Messiah that he was expecting. Instead of one who had come to reject and punish Israel's enemy, he had come to include and to heal them. It wasn't Jesus who was misaligned, it was John. Now he has a choice. What do I do with that? What do I do with that? Do I walk away or do I adjust my understanding? And do I incorporate that new revelation of who Jesus is and what he is doing into the world now into my life? When something happens for us, things change for us and we change. And something has happened to all of us. Something big has happened to all of us. And we have to be okay with acknowledging that and owning that. And we have to know that it's okay. And we have to know that we all have to do some work to work out what it is that has shifted and why it is that it is shifted. Look, don't tell me that COVID has not affected people. Don't tell me that COVID has not affected the church. I see it almost every day. I definitely see it every Sunday, like every other pastor does at the moment. Did you know around only 60% of people have returned to church from pre-COVID, right? 60% of people. And even then, not all at the same time. If you look around here, each week we have between 50 to 55% of who actually comprises this church here any given Sunday, right? Attendance patterns have actually changed dramatically. Where it used to be maybe 2 out of 4 that people would come, now it's 1 out of 4 or 5 that people are going, right? 1 out of 4 or 5. 40% of people are now missing in action. Between 13 to 15% of those people have slipped into full-on atheism. The others have now completely, or on a spectrum, have either completely to kind of disengaged and disconnected from their church communities, which is why in most churches these days you will see between 50 and 60% of people turning up who is actually there. Now, it wasn't COVID's fault. COVID didn't precipitate all of this. COVID accelerated all of this. There was already some soul searching going on in people and shifts and changes. COVID just accelerated this. So what it means is there are less people in church less often, which means there is more things for people in church to do more often. Okay? We're seeing this impact everywhere. In some places, I know of 2 churches who only 12% of their congregation have returned. 12%. Massive. This stuff is going on absolutely everywhere. People have changed. People's values have changed. People's priorities have changed. Our habits were broken and we've gone back to a big rethink about what's important in life and all sorts of other things, and we have not come back to the place that we left. People's theologies and their beliefs have changed because it's being reflected in their practices, and yet most people do not know what has changed or why. They just know they do different now. That's it. That's why we're talking about it, because it's not always a straight up theological or belief issue. Like today, maybe some of that is. But that's why next week's going to be important, because we're going to be talking about some of the other underlying issues that are causing this and that are being reflected in our behaviours and our priorities and the values that we have. Something has happened. It has happened to all of us, and most of us still don't know what. But let me finish with this. God is okay with you not knowing which way is up at the moment. God is okay with you struggling. God is okay with you working it out. Even more, we're okay with it as well. I would rather you be connected and struggling, right, than disconnected. That's fine. That's why I'm not getting all head up and getting all legalistic and you need to do this and you need to do that. We're all working through something because we've been collectively traumatized, okay? And that's why we said at the beginning of the year, my wife was a big voice in this in my own ear, it's a big year and beyond of just pastoring and loving people, because we've got to work this stuff through. Now, yeah, we've got to try and function in the meantime, which is why instead of a full band, we get a guitar and a singer, which incidentally was fantastic today, Jeremy and Annabelle. And it always is, like we're running at diminished capacity. We'll get through, but the show is not the most important thing. You guys are. And your life and how you're tracking, that's the most important thing to us. So we're willing to take hits with all of this sort of stuff. And if we can't do a thing, we can't do a thing. It doesn't matter. We want you to know it's okay. And we're here and we want to help you. If we can pray for you, if we can discuss things with you, it doesn't matter. It's going to take all sorts of forms. We want you to know it's okay and we're here for you in that. And it's not just you, it's people like me. It's your senior pastor. I'm working through this stuff too. Okay, so, I need your understanding and compassion as well why I do this, because, sometimes I'm just not doing that well, to be honest. I know you can't tell because I just get up here and I perform fantastically as usual, and I just... but no, sometimes I'm not doing that well. But, I want us to be honest about that, and I want us to be able to work this stuff through together because Jesus is okay with that. We might be sitting here going, I don't know, Jesus, are you really who you said you were and you're going to do what you said you would? He goes, let me tell you how it is. It's okay. All right? So rest in that. Right, we're going to take some communion now. And again, this is an opportunity for us to come around the table. Everyone is invited. There's some at the sides and the back. Everyone is welcome to come to this table this morning. And let's keep it simple. Let's just take communion and remind ourselves that this symbol that we take every week, these emblems that we take every week, are symbolic of God's faithfulness to us. Even when we get wobbly in our own faith, His is unshakable. This thing that he did through the body and blood of Jesus is a forever thing. And he loves us unconditionally, right? So let's just remind ourselves of that and take it. And if you're struggling, to say, God, can you meet me in this place? Do something that I don't even understand, because I need a touch from you this morning, all right?